Mr. Allen. Thank you. I think we are just taking a look at those who are already there.
Problem. Give me just 1 second to pull up my things and get everything aligned. Okay, I think I am set. If you are set on your end.
Yes, we are good to go.
Okay.
Thanks.
Got it. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charles Allen, Chair of the Transportation Planning Board, and I'm calling to order the TPB's October 20th, 2021 meeting to order. As we continue meeting virtually during the pandemic, we will continue to live stream the audio and video online and on our YouTube channel. We will continue to monitor the personal and public health situation to determine when it would be best and safe to resume our in-person meetings. While we are all familiar with our process for these virtual meetings, for the benefit of those following the meeting online or joining the first time, let me briefly review the procedures that we follow during our virtual meetings. To start the meeting, I'm going to ask staff to take a roll call of members or alternates to document your presence at this meeting and make sure that we have a quorum. Then for action items on the agenda, I'll have the presenter complete their briefing, invite a motion, or I might make the motion myself to approve and seek a second for the, I'll then seek a second for the motion made. After the motion's been made and seconded, I'll invite questions and comments in turn by jurisdiction before calling for a vote. And then for the vote, what we do is we ask for the nays and abstentions and take the rest as yes votes. And so what I'll do is call those votes in turn by jurisdiction. For the informational items, I'll have the presenters complete their briefing, and then of course we'll turn to questions and comments also in turn by jurisdiction. We're going to do our best to adhere to the schedule and conclude the meeting on time, so I'll request all to be mindful of time during your comments and questions, please. And lastly, a friendly reminder to mute your microphones as always, and importantly to unmute your mic and state your name and jurisdiction when it's your turn to speak. Lynn, let me turn to you then first, and we will begin with a roll call to confirm that we do have a quorum.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be reading down the list. I'm going to state the name of your jurisdiction or agency, and if you could tell us what your name is, we'll capture that if I go too fast, or if you show up a little bit later, I'll be monitoring the participant list as well. I'm aware of one person coming later, that's Mr. Angry, and Pablo's here right now, but we'll get to that soon. We'll start with the District of Columbia. District Council, Ms. Pinto, or Ms. Hanson. District Council, Mr. Allen.
Here.
District Council, Ms. Henderson. District Office of Planning.
Kristen Culkin's here.
Thanks. District Department of Transportation.
Mark Rawlings is here.
Thank you. We'll move on to Maryland, City of Bowie. Charles County.
Jason Groth, alternate here.
Thanks. College Park.
Patrick Wyand, Mayor of College Park here.
Thanks.
Denise Mitchell, council member alternate here.
Great, thank you. Frederick County.
Dan Gardner, County Executive, present.
Thank you. City of Frederick.
Russell, present.
Thanks. City of Gaithersburg.
Neil Harris is here.
And Dennis Enslinger, alternate, is here.
Thank you. City of Greenbelt.
Emmett Jordan here.
Thank you. City of Laurel.
Mike Leves here.
Thank you. Montgomery County Executive.
Gary Orenrich is here.
Thank you. Montgomery County Legislative.
Evan Glass is here.
Thanks. Prince George's County Executive.
Victor Weisberg is here.
Thanks, Vic. Prince George's County Legislative.
Good morning, everyone. Vice Chair Tavera is present.
Thank you. City of Rockville.
Good morning, everybody. Bridget Newton's here.
Good morning. Tacoma Park.
Hello, Casey Kostick is here.
Maryland House of Delegates.
Mark Corman, present.
Carol Graham, alternate here.
Great, thanks. Maryland Senate.
Nancy King here.
Thank you. Maryland Department of Transportation.
Earl Lewis here.
Good morning or good afternoon. Moving on to Virginia, City of Alexandria. Arlington County. Oh wait, Canick, did I hear? I'll double check. I couldn't hear you. I see you, but I can't hear you. So maybe we can, when you talk in a few minutes, we might have to work on that. Arlington County.
Christian Dorsey is present.
Thanks. City of Fairfax. Fairfax County.
Walter Alcorn here.
James Walkinshaw's here.
Thank you. Falls Church. Fauquier County. Loudoun County.
Kristen Umstadt is here.
Thank you.
Bob Brown, alternate for Matt Letourneau, is here.
Great, thank you. Manassas.
Good afternoon, Pam Sabeski's here.
Manassas Park.
Jeanette Rischel here.
Thank you. Prince William County.
Ann Wheeler here.
Thanks.
And Paula Belita, alternate member.
Thank you. And for the rest of you, Mr. Angry is coming in about a half an hour. Virginia House of Delegates. Virginia Senate.
Dave Marsden is here.
Thank you. Virginia Department of Transportation.
Good afternoon. John Lynch is here.
And WMATA.
Good afternoon. Mark Phillips, alternate, is here, and I'm fairly certain Shamkanan will be joining.
Great, thanks. We'll move on to our ex officio members. Federal Highway Administration. Federal Transit Administration. National Capital Planning Commission. Metropolitan Washington Airports Authority. And National Park Service. Okay, great. That concludes our roll call. Again, I will keep an eye on the participants list. We have a quorum. Mr. Chair, back to you.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Appreciate that. Next, I'm turning right back to you, though. I think we have a couple of public comments that we received, and so let me turn to you if you're able to help summarize those. And I believe the full comments were shared with everyone via email.
That's right. Thank you, Chairman Allen. For the October 2021 TPB meeting, the TPB received a total of 3 comments that were emailed to us from the same person. A memo with a summary of the comments, as well as the comments themselves, can be found in our TPB meeting event page. These comments reflected this person's opinion on the Maryland Op Lanes project, and they also shared 2 articles on roadway widening and P3 projects. As I mentioned, all comments are found on our meeting page, and so that concludes my brief report. Thank you, Chair Allen.
Thank you very much, Lynn. All right, next up, we always move next to our approval of the minutes. So we're going to review and adopt the minutes from our September 22nd meeting. I will make a motion to adopt the minutes of our September 22nd meeting. Is there a second?
Sabeski, second.
Thank you, Ms. Sabeski. All right, are there any corrections or comments on the meeting minutes before we move to a vote? All right, hearing none, then we will move to a vote. Again, we do it quickly by jurisdiction. I'll call it the jurisdiction. You are voting nay or abstention. If you're silent, that means that you are voting in support. So to the vote, to the District of Columbia first, to Maryland, Virginia, and WMATA and any other agencies. All right, thank you very much. I'll take that as a unanimous vote of approval for the minutes of the September 22nd meeting. Next, we're going to move to the technical committee report. Everyone should have a written summary of the October 1st meeting. I'm going to turn to our chair, Jason Groth, to help highlight any particular aspects of the committee's work, and then we'll turn to any questions you may have for Jason after that. Jason, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. So essentially the committee met on the 1st of the month and as always had a robust discussion. Covered several items that are on today's agenda, so I won't be the spoiler alert on any of those items. But of particular note, one thing I found interesting and had quite a bit of conversation during the meeting was the regional travel survey and the data that's coming out. That's a recurring item on our agenda. And one of the things that's I think is of interest to this board and especially to the technical committee was the percentage, was sort of an in-depth look at teleworking and what the current results are and that sort of thing. So of particular note was that telework is obviously up and continues to be up. Some facts that were a little bit eye-opening, but I guess if we think about it a little bit harder, were kind of obvious, which is that the percentage of telework within a half-mile radius of a high-capacity transit station was actually quite high. So at first you think, well, they're near transit, they have mobility options, but also in those areas, they're more urbanized. They've got great high-speed internet in most cases and that sort of thing. So it's an obvious choice that teleworking would be high there. Another thing is that teleworking was obviously higher. The higher the income, had higher occurrences of teleworking versus salaries below $50,000 had a much lower use of teleworking. And perhaps that's because those jobs were more labor intensive and they weren't able to telework, that sort of thing. But I encourage the board to look at the details in the report. You can look under the technical committee website from the October 1st meeting. There's a great slideshow in there from staff, and I encourage you to take a look at it. So unless there's any questions, that concludes my report, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Groth. Let's see if there are any questions. I'll just do a quick jurisdiction roll call. So WMATA and any other agencies? Virginia? Maryland?
Chair Ellen, this is Casey from Tacoma
Ms.
Park.
Costick.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Groth, for the report. I just kind of wanted to follow up on the connection between the telework, the study on telework and the numbers teleworking, and then the other item that was covered related to the COVID impact on traffic levels and transit use. And I wondered if the committee had any discussion on the fact that the traffic levels seem to be back up to about 95%, even though the telework levels are pretty high for a number of the offices in the region. And, are there things we should be thinking about? Are there things we can be doing to kind of address what seems like it could be a pretty big issue coming down the line in a few months when we might not have such high telework levels if the traffic kind of continues, and where the different volumes of traffic are coming from. If it's kind of a straight connection from people who are in those high capacity areas who are teleworking now and will kind of convert back to transit, or not. Just curious if there is any discussion on that or things we as a board should be thinking about.
There was definitely discussion on that very item, and there's a lot of speculation on why that is. I'm not sure there's any concrete answers or solutions yet. Some of the speculation is that perhaps people are a little timid going back to group scenarios like transit, where you're sharing the same space with other people in close proximity, and thus people are choosing to either drive or perhaps carpool with people they're comfortable with for now. But certainly it's kind of a wait and see type thing at the moment as comfort levels hopefully return and transit ridership is back up. I mean, obviously transit ridership has come back a good bit compared to where it was this time last year. But there at this point, I think it's mainly a lot of speculation because it's the data. The data that we have is what we're working off of, and the answers that in that level of depth, I guess, weren't part of the survey. So it'd be interesting to see what happens in the coming months. I wish I had a better answer for you.
No, thank you. That's helpful.
Great, thank you, Casey. So I'm going counterclockwise this time. So if I go back now to the district for Jason. All right, Mr. Groth, thank you very much for your report out. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to turn to the Community Advisory Committee and access for all advisory committee reports. So first, let me turn to our Community Advisory Committee. We had the report on the meeting. I think everyone has a copy of that full report, but let me turn to Elisa Walton to see if there is any additional information or items that she'd like to highlight for us.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. The CAC met last Thursday. We received a briefing on the climate change mitigation study, including the scope and the background, and we also reviewed the slides from the September TPB meeting. There's a few questions and comments that came out of the CAC discussion on that. How can the region set goals and measure success for shifting travel behaviors? How will TPB staff share results of the study and work with the CAC and others to make sure that the findings are communicated widely and in an accessible way? Can the region's electricity infrastructure support increased demand on the grid as a result of increased EV use? And what incentives can be put in place at the regional, state, and federal level to encourage use of electric vehicles? We also received a briefing on the Enhanced Mobility Program, and a lot of the community Questions really centered around what types of groups are eligible for this, if there's technical assistance for smaller or newer groups to help with their applications, and whether there's opportunities for organizations to collaborate on applications so that there's a wider breadth of applicants that can be successful. We also received a briefing on the connected and automated vehicles and the draft set of regional principles. There were some questions about interoperability between CAVs and infrastructure, funding challenges related to CAVs, and whether it was realistic to expect that CAVs would be revenue neutral in the region. And that was really the quick summary of our discussions. So unless there's any questions, that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ms. Walton. Let's see if anybody has any questions. First, I'll go to the district. Any questions from Maryland? Virginia? And then WMATA and any other agencies? All right, Ms. Walton, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Next, let me turn to our colleague, Kanik Aguirre from the City of Alexandria, who shared our Access for All Advisory Committee meeting last month. Everyone has a written summary of that, but Kanik, let me turn to you and see if there's anything you'd like to help highlight for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good afternoon, everyone. So you guys all have the readout. I think what I would like to mention under the Visualize 2045 part, when we were kind of reviewing the results from the focus groups and got an update on the public outreach, I feel that certain themes kind of emerged. One of them was safety during ridership, combined with kind of cleanliness of the modes that people were using, especially on buses. There was definitely a theme of respect, feeling respected, whether getting on the bus and treated by the bus driver or by a conductor, or even just a matter of having a trash can or a shelter at a bus stop, right? There's definitely this theme of how do I feel as a rider when I am utilizing these services? And then the other theme was definitely one around affordability, and a lot of housing got tied into it, even though this conversation was heavily around the transportation. How do you feel about it? There was a lot of input about, well, you know, if I was able to afford my transportation more, then I'd have a better opportunity for my housing. Or if my housing was closer to the transportation, then you know, I'd be able to save more money. Or if I had the proper transportation, I could actually get a different type of job. But because I don't have that transportation, or because it's not affordable, so as we all know, there's a 100% nexus between housing and transportation, as where I think we're going to talk about later on as well. But I think those were three themes that really popped out. So safety, respect, and this affordability and housing connection. So I thought that was interesting to see how heavily we discussed some of those things. We also got a dissertation on the wheelchair accessibility, and I thought that was very interesting, but we can't necessarily share a lot of the details yet because it is proprietary. So I'm looking forward to the report coming out from Dr. Matat Gebrselassie. I think it'll be interesting to go back and take a look at it, especially what people think about rideshare and the utilization of it. And the last thing that we talked about, of course, were TPB principles on connected and autonomous vehicles. Two things to highlight: the CAVs having difficulty recognizing darker skin. This has been an issue for several years relating to programming and the technology sector. So we want to make sure that regardless of one's skin color, that these autonomous vehicles are going to be able to identify you as a person, which is extremely, extremely important. I mean, I can't believe we're even having to bring this up, but unfortunately it is the case. And then the other one was concerns around some legal responsibilities and the larger picture importance of coordinating at all levels: private sector, federal government, local level, and more. So these principles will be sent out to all members, and we'll be requesting feedback for consideration and developing the final version as well. And as always, folks are always welcome to our meetings. And want to make sure to mention too that Lynn was explaining a little bit about the AFA's role for the Human Service Transportation Coordinator Plan, and this will be a bulk of our task looking into 2022. And our next meeting will be November 12th. So as I was saying, all are always welcome. So thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Mr. Aguirre. Let me start to see if there are any questions. Let's see, I can't remember which order I went in last time, so I'll just start over again. Let me start with the district. All right, then Maryland. Ms. Taveras, I think I saw your hand up.
Why? Just curious, why are the autonomous vehicles having challenges with pigmentation? Skin pigmentation.
Lynn, did you
Ms.
guys want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, Ms. Taveras, this is Kanti. It's got more to do with the camera and recognition features of technology. It is a known issue even within the technology discipline. There have been newer editions and generations of camera sensitivity and the associated object recognition software systems that are being developed. But it is one of those issues where particularly street side lighting and all of that affects into how these technologies are able to recognize both human beings and certain objects in navigating. Within the planners of discipline, they currently prefer to use automated vehicles as opposed to autonomous vehicles because of these sorts of issues still being there.
Because I remember hearing that there was a lot of issues with artificial intelligence options developed in China because they use a lot of different conglomerated pictures, but most of it are the same type or Caucasian, so in lighter pigmentation individuals. So that's why on that end, but I don't know. I mean, I'm just saying in terms of where are these systems being developed?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think Mr. Aguirre may not be in the position to be able to answer some of those deeper issues just from the same way this is what the committee was helping review, but perhaps TPB staff could, for Ms. Taveras, could help maybe.
Well, I'm really curious about it because we can, this is something that we could definitely tackle. I think we could definitely tackle it stateside. And I had been working with Dr. Charles Vela, who's he's the gentleman that developed the STEM concept. He's actually Salvadoran, who lives here in Montgomery County. But his sons are experts in AI and machine learning and things like that. And I think that these are players that we could bring. I mean, they're worldwide recognized. We could bring some really great thinkers to the table who understands these sensitivities, and we can maybe see if we could work with them. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Let me turn next to again questions for Mr. Aguirre. I think we've gone through Maryland, so let me turn to Virginia. And then WMATA and any other agencies. All right, Mr. Aguirre, thank you again very much. We appreciate that. All right, next item, we're going to turn to our steering committee actions and report from the director. So everybody should have a written summary of the October 8th steering committee meeting and the director's report. Conti, let me turn to you though to help go over the highlights and pressing issues there. And then we'll turn questions to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of items from the written memo to draw your attention to, and an update on a couple items that is not in the memo. You'll recall that the TPB joined MVAC and COG's Climate, Energy, Environment Policy Committee to provide comments on federal proposals on greenhouse gas emissions. So that was done last month. That came out of the EPA. And subsequently, there was another proposed rule, this one from US DOT, proposing to make the tailpipe greenhouse gas emission standards. Following up on the EPA's action, the US DOT had proposed improving the fuel economy standards or the CAFE standards of vehicles. That is a very important factor to help reduce emissions, particularly greenhouse gases. So it was a proposed rule. So TPB, MVAC, and CPC have jointly commented to the federal docket in support of that proposal. The steering committee reviewed the draft and it approved it at its meeting on October 1st. MVAC and CPC executive committee reviewed the draft. They have approved it and formally signed letter, and the copy has been posted to the TPB website as well. Secondly, in the packet, you will find on page 16 the schedule for the board meetings and steering committee meetings for next year. So I'm glad to note that all 11 meetings of the board will be on the third Wednesday of the month. Sometimes holidays affect that. So that is one of a couple of steering committee meetings will be on a different day. So if you would please make a note of that. And then lastly, in the next couple of months, staff will be presenting the next round of updates to the region's roadway safety targets. This has been a top priority for the TPB and for the region. Our roadway safety is really not at an acceptable level. Last year, we received detailed briefings from the DOTs on what various initiatives and programs they were implementing to improve roadway safety. This year, we requested written report from all three DOTs, and their report, you will find them on pages 21 through 42. I draw their reports to your attention. I won't review all of them, but having reviewed it, one of the takeaways for me is that both Maryland and the District of Columbia report that the roadway fatalities have increased during the pandemic. This is all data for 2020. And the fatalities have increased despite a significant reduction in vehicle miles traveled. Virginia reported a slight decrease in fatalities, but again, not proportional to the amount of vehicle miles traveled that was reduced. And all three states have noted in the report that aggressive driving, enabled by lower congestion, and speeding were all main contributing factors for this. One piece of good news is that all three states reported a decrease in serious injury crashes. And that's been a continuing trend and that was in place even before the pandemic. That is somethingly good, but there is still progress that needs to be made. We as staff will continue to work with the DOTs to bring additional briefings to the board in the coming year on what additions or enhancements they have been making to help expedite the safety outcomes on our roadways. A couple of topics to update, which is not in the memo. You have been briefed on the results of the TPB's once in a decade survey of our region's households. Jason Groth briefly mentioned about this as well in his report. Staff had solicited requests from all of your member agency staffs if there was any specific aspect of travel behavior, travel choices that our region's households were making, that we could take a deeper dive in this data. It's a very rich data. And we received 11 specific topics. And we have completed over the past year, we completed a deep dive on all 11 topics of the data and tried to figure out what does the data from the 2017-2018 household survey tell us. All of this has been published on the TPB website. We are taking the findings to the TPB Tech Committee for a detailed review, and you will probably be hearing more about that in the coming months. The last item of update is the Street Smart bicycle and pedestrian safety outreach campaign that the TPB does every fall and spring. This year, we are proceeding and planning to have it as an in-person event, and that will much thanks to Prince George's County, where the kickoff event is planned. The launch is, we are hoping to get this underway on Thursday, November 4th in Oxon Hill in the plaza in front of Mount Joy Baptist Church. Appropriate health guidance and precautions will be taken. So once again, trying to bring home, particularly as fall comes upon us and visibility and lighting becomes an issue, we want to undertake this campaign for Street Smart. So that's a quick update from me, Mr. Allen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Kanti. Let's turn and see if there's any questions for Kanti on his report out. Let me start with WMATA and any other agencies. Okay, let me turn to Virginia.
Sure.
I think, Mr. Snyder, I think I see your hand up.
Yes, thanks much. I just want to
I don't think we can hear you very well, Mr. Snyder.
Mine says I'm off mute. I don't know.
We can hear you. It just sound, at least for me, it sounds really faint.
Okay, can you hear me now? Just, I don't want to take much time. I just want to underscore Kanti's comments about safety, the deterioration, and the need to continue to focus on it. So hopefully we'll have additional presentations in the future about what more we can do as a region. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Snyder. Anyone else from Virginia? All right, let me turn to Maryland, and Mr. Corman, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kanti, the Maryland chart on page 24, I just want to make sure I understand it. There's 5 performance measurements. It's a 5-year period. The period's 2017 to 2021. The actual results they have, though, are 2015 to 2019, yet they already know they're not going to meet the goals for the end of 2021. Is that based on, this is how we did 4 years ago, or the last 4-year period, so we know we're not going to make it this time? Is that based on the current trend line they're seeing? And what exactly, what do the no's represent in that last column?
Yeah, I think you've highlighted the issue there. The federal requirement is requiring that you use the past, that these targets have to be data driven. So they are looking at a 5-year rolling average. So each year they're going to drop 1 year and add another year for which they have full data. So that past trend is indicating that if that trend continues, so the first thing is you have to look at the 5-year data and set the targets according to what the data dictates. But the trend is saying that because of this increase, we are not going to be hitting the target unless some enhanced interventions happen. So that has been the challenge, that particularly with fatalities, with serious injury crashes, the trend and the intervention measures appear to be working well, although not as quickly as we would like. But with the fatalities, we continue to have that challenge. The data dictates us to set a certain target, but the trend is indicating it's going to be hard to reach that without enhanced intervention.
Thank you. Do you think we could request the 2016 to 2020 update on this? This is now all pre-COVID, and I'm sure the 2020 data is available. We're in October of 2021. Is that something you can ask for? I mean, I can also go to the State Highway Administration, but.
No, we'll get the data. There is generally a lag after the data is collected, QA/QC, and it's been officially, but we will be able to get that data, Mr. Corman, certainly.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Corman. Anyone else from Maryland? All right, then let me turn to the district. All right, thank you, Kanti. All right, that brings us to the chairman's remarks. I'll try to be brief. At one point, I'd kind of hoped that maybe this was going to be the month where we talk about federal transportation and infrastructure bill finally passing Congress, but that hadn't happened. But hopefully before the end of the year, we're going to be able to talk about that. So we'll keep our eyes open on that. There were 2 things I did want to touch on. One is actually building off of what Kanti was just talking about, and I think that we're all concerned about, related to and aggressive driving. I know in my jurisdiction in the district, we have seen just a rising number of people killed on our streets and at intersections. Every single person probably can share their own experience of a close call, or a neighbor, a constituent, a friend who's had the same. I will say we've been increasingly having a conversation, and we brought this up actually maybe a year or 2 ago as a board here, that when we looked at the enforcement of dangerous driving with our ATE, our automated traffic enforcement systems, that regionally we don't have the type of reciprocity. So for example, in the district, when there are drivers from Maryland, Virginia driving dangerously and getting tickets, there is no enforcement mechanism. Likewise, when there is a district resident that is driving dangerously in Maryland and Virginia, there is no reciprocity for them as well. I certainly understand as an elected official that it is hard sometimes to tell people they're going to have to pay those tickets. But I do believe that all of us have a collective interest in trying to have this, because if there's a district driver that is dangerous on your streets, I don't want that. And I want them to have to pay the fine, and they're creating hazards and danger on your streets. And in the same way, if there's a driver from Virginia or Maryland that's driving dangerous in the district, they need to be held accountable. Each of us in our own capacities has the ability, I think, to help make sure that we are telling DOT officials, other administration officials, that we should have a regional agreement, a regional reciprocity on this. I think it is in all of our shared interests. And so I just wanted to speak to that, because it's something that's been in the news lately and something I think that we need to continue pushing on. And this is a body that can help continue to do that. Secondly, I do want to, it'd be hard to not talk about WMATA right now, and with the measures taken to protect safety. It's a very significant and serious issue. I will say I look at this also, though, as seeing WMATA taking very seriously the safety of their riders, and taking this very significant step. I think it is impacting a lot of our constituents and communities, of course, and it's unfolding as to how extensive this is going to be and how long it's going to be. But I do believe when we talk about rebuilding the ridership for our metro system, rebuilding that regional ridership, I do believe that trust is going to be at the heart of that. That's going to be trust for making sure you're confident that the air is clean when you're on your car or on your bus, to making sure that WMATA is taking seriously safety. And so I know that I've heard some say they're not sure that some of the steps that would have been taken this week would have been done in the past. And I think that's something I do want to give credit to WMATA for doing that. And of course, tough questions have to be asked about exactly how much did we know, when was it known, and all the appropriate questions and oversight. But I do believe that this can be viewed as, and should be viewed as, taking a step that puts safety first and foremost of the riders. And I want that to believe for there to be a reciprocity, or let that be the trust building that takes place for all of us to be able to see our successful system. So just want to kind of comment on those two pieces, and that's about it. We're going to move to our next item then, which is moving to our action items. We're 8 minutes ahead of schedule, I believe, which is great. So we are now going to turn to item number 7 on the agenda, optimizing land use around high capacity transit and elevating equity emphasis areas. I'm happy to welcome back Chuck Bean, COG's Executive Director. Chuck had briefed us last month of COG's board plans to adopt a couple of planning priorities for the region that uses a couple of TPB's planning products, the high capacity transit station and the equity emphasis areas. In my recollection, he talked about these two being part of the Fab 4 of planning priorities for the region. So Chuck is going to brief us on COG board's actions on this matter. And then we have a resolution, which is R42022 to consider. And so, but before we move to that though, let me turn to Chuck Bean. Chuck, good afternoon.
Thank you, Chair Allen. Leo, if you could bring up that slide deck when convenient, I appreciate it. Just a word about how we got here and where we're going with this unified planning construct. And as background, just a word about the COG board and TPB. TPB is the federally designated MPO focused on transportation. COG board, a little oversimplistic to say everything else, but for this conversation, let's say everything else. And of course, transportation is related to everything else, and everything is interwoven within transportation. So that's why we need to increasingly think in a holistic, cross-disciplinary manner. So the construct here, starting with the lower right, achieve regional housing targets. This was adopted by the COG board in 2019. But this is directly related to TPB's aspirational initiatives from 2045, bring more housing closer to jobs. Lower left, climate targets. This was adopted by the COG board in 2020, reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, along with the Regional Climate Energy Action Plan. Need to think multi-sector across this issue. Personally, I was impressed by the presentation by ICF to TPB last month, the scenario analysis and transportation. And we'll need to figure out how to do this scenario analysis and that kind of depth in energy and in the built environment. Then to equity emphasis areas, weaving in equity throughout all we do. This is in part a fusion of work across transportation health and our work with GARE, Government Alliance for Race and Equity, out of TPB's prior work in environmental justice, the analysis of census tracts designated as equity emphasis areas arose. Same time around 2019, chief health officers looked at the social determinants of health, looking at all of these census tracts. And I work with GARE, looking at analysis between these census tracts and the rest of the region. So the COG board resolution is to elevate these census tracts throughout all of our planning. Then the last, high capacity transit station areas. Chair Allen, if I were to go back, I might restate the title of the work to say station areas of high capacity transit, because the salient point here is focusing on optimizing the land use around high capacity transit. Not to put too fine a point on it, not the transit itself per se, leaving that to TPB, but picking up on the land use optimization of the transit plans as we have them and as they will evolve in the next few years. So land use and transportation outcomes. Land use, meaning mixed use and mixed income, is getting at the housing targets, optimizing density as appropriate, and bringing housing closer to jobs. All this adds up to major contributions to our climate goals. So these together, transit, land use, housing, climate, are the region shaping planning constructs, now unified, that will be our framework for the next decade. It's in that context the COG board passes the baton back to TPB for its consideration of these resolutions. And as I do that, I want to recognize particularly those board members who are on both boards, Mr. Collins, Ms. Gardner, Mr. Jordan, Ms. Mitchell, Ms. Newton, Mr. Snyder, Chair Wheeler, and also Christian Dorsey, who's vice chair of the COG board. And Mr. Dorsey, with that, I turn it to you.
Thank you, Chuck, and thank you, Chair Allen, for the opportunity to go ahead and make the motion to introduce this resolution for TPB's consideration. With your indulgence, Mr. Allen, I'll just say a couple of editorial words before getting to the meat of the resolution, but I promise to be brief. The COG board is very enthusiastic about pursuing this unified planning framework, as we have long sought to make sure the good work that we do is efficiently executed throughout the region and provides maximum benefit to the region. And while focusing on various priorities from year to year is never a bad thing, having a unified planning framework from which to operate ensures that from year to year, as members change, we actually get to pursue progress and be accountable for that progress. So as we think about the two resolutions that the COG board considered, in substance, what they're really doing is making sure that we account for the various differences that we have throughout our region, but really focus on those areas of similarity and where we've come to a common regional understanding, and this can't be overstated, is that we have these high capacity transit station areas, which are the epitome of pursuing smart growth strategies, as they occupy only 10% of the land use of our region. And it's through maximizing these that we can pursue the interconnected priorities of sufficient housing supply to meet the regional demand through growth. We can also pursue greater opportunities for affordability of housing to meet the income needs of our community. We can reduce congestion by taking vehicles off the roads and maximizing the investments that we've already made and will make in transit. And we can also increase active transportation, which will have the benefits of improving personal health and serving as an effective tool to combat climate change. So as we look at the existing now 225 HCTs throughout our region, the resolution that COG adopted calls for prioritizing them at all levels of planning, making sure local governments look at walk and bike sheds and tools like micro transit to again maximize and make efficient that already existing infrastructure, and that we take advantage of a key TPB Visualize 2045 priority and fully commit to building out the National Capital Trail Network, as we all know, mostly planned and already half built. And from the equity framework, giving real action to something that we currently are committed to rhetorically, but giving us a framework for accountability, looking at areas in our community where we have significant concentrations of low-income earners, minority groups, or a combination of the two. And we can then use these equity emphasis areas to guide our capital investments and our programmatic initiatives and activities, and really get toward improving opportunities for the 1.5 million people who live in the equity emphasis areas, to ensure that they're not missing from the transformative benefits that we hope for our region. So it is with that what we're calling on today through the TPB resolution, if we can pull up that slide, is to endorse the COG resolutions concerning HCTs and equity emphasis areas, and that we also call upon all of our member agencies to adopt the principles that these resolutions contain while making decisions in transportation planning and programming, and that we use these as key critical bases for our work on long-range planning in the future and for anything that we do. And if we successfully are able to do all of this, just imagine the world where the work of TPB and COG is working at maximum efficiency and synergy. It will produce nothing but benefits for the people that we serve. And so with that, I move adoption of Resolution R4 2022.
Thank you,
I'll
Mr.
second it.
Second.
Oh, there's a lot of seconds out there at the same time. All right, Ms. Newton, I think I saw your hand up, so we'll take that as the same. Thank you, Ms. Newton. All right, before we, so now that it's been seconded, let's see if there's any discussion on the motion. I'll certainly just kick us off real fast with a thanks to Chuck, to Christian, to everybody who worked on this. This really is, I think, just kind of the follow-up to our conversation last month, and really creates a really great sense of alignment between both the COG board and the TPB on some areas of some shared emphasis and some shared action that we want to be taking. So I really appreciate, we had a pretty robust conversation about it last month. I don't know if we need to redo that entire conversation here, but I do think that this has been it's entirely consistent. I think the action was that we wanted to take, and again, appreciate the work that went into it. So I'll be very much in support of this. Let's see if there's any conversations. We'll do the kind of our jurisdiction go around. So anybody else from the district? All right, let me turn next to Maryland.
Hi, this is Vic Weisberg with Prince George's County. We enthusiastically support this motion, but also want to work with COG to frankly do even more, and to look at ways and appreciate Mr. Bean's presentation and discussion of integration into the various work plans. Would like to endorse that and endorse looking at how we can dig in even deeper than may already be programmed. There's just so much advancing how we can move forward equity and investment in these high capacity transit station areas is an imperative that is the right thing to do, but also the prudent thing to do, and will, for relatively low investments, will reap tremendous benefits, both in terms of addressing gaps in income and services, but addressing issues like congestion and evening out commutes. So I want to endorse the motion, but also if Conti or Mr. Bean want to expand a little bit about the action steps for moving these very noble thoughts into actions and deeds. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weisberg. Anyone else from Maryland? Right, Virginia? And Vermont, any other agencies? All right, then we shall move on to the vote then now. So we'll do the same thing by jurisdiction. Remember that when we're voting, if it's a nay or abstention, that's what we want to hear from you. Your silence means that you are in support. So now we'll do it in reverse order, back around the horn. So let me start with WMATA. Any other agencies? Any nays or abstentions? To Virginia? To Maryland? And to the district? All right, Conti and Lynn, I let the record reflect that's a unanimous vote in support, passing and approving resolution R42022. So thank you very much. Thanks again, Chuck and Christian, for working on that. All right, next up then, we're going to move to our informational items. So our first item, number 8 on your agenda, is the status report on the 2021 Enhanced Mobility Grant Program. This next item is related to one of the largest financial grants that the TPB provides every other year. Lynn Winchell-Mindy is going to brief us on the program and where we are in selecting our grant recipients. And then we're going to be asked to approve the grants next month. So this is informational item this month, and then we'll be asked to approve next month. Lynn, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chair Allen, and good afternoon to everybody. So I've been before you quite a bit recently with some of the stimulus money, but as Chair Allen said, this is our big solicitation that occurs every 2 years for enhanced mobility. And I'm going to provide just an overview of that program. Next slide, please. So as I said, I'm providing an overview of the Section 5310 Enhanced Mobility Program. I'm going to briefly review the solicitation process, and then hopefully we'll be coming before you in November to request approval of the amendment of the TIP and approval of the projects recommended for funding. Next slide. So this slide just shows us an overview of how we accomplish the goal of improving mobility for older adults and people with disabilities in our region. So we have the coordinated plan. Chair Aguirre mentioned that from the work of the AFA, which will focus on that this year, the actual enhanced mobility program that funds the projects, and then our 2021 solicitation, which we're in the midst of right now. Next slide. So the coordinated plan is a federal requirement, and it guides the implementation of the enhanced mobility program. It's required to be updated every 4 years. It will be updated in 2022, and it's developed with input from our Access for All Advisory Committee. So that, as Chair Aguirre said, will be our focus for AFA in the coming year. The plan has 3 main components, which are identifying need in the region, identifying the strategies to address those needs, and then priority projects. I'm going to go over each of these just briefly in the interest of time. Next slide. I'm actually going to skip this one. This kind of just goes over the mechanism. So the strategies for addressing the unmet need, which is part of what the AFA helps us identify in the process of the update, the strategies address availability, awareness, accessibility, and affordability of transportation options. Next slide. This is a list of what have been identified as our priority projects for the region. So you'll see things like mobility management, door-through-door transportation, and then providing direct transportation for clients of human service agencies. So in our solicitation process, priority projects get a little bump up in scoring, but any project that fits the program and is scored high and is approved for recommended funding can be funded. We just try to guide the projects towards things that have been identified as needed in the region. Next slide. Oops, I accidentally muted myself. So this is a map of what's called our urbanized area for federal funding. So it's the DC, Virginia, Maryland urbanized area. It's a little bit different than the TPB planning area. Outside of that, what shows up as orange on the screen, at least for me, are other regions where DRPT or MTA handle the 5310 program. So as Chair Erlin said, it's a unique role for TPB in that we prioritize and actually select projects for funding, and then COG implements the project. So we're able to do this and see what comes of these projects in the region and how it benefits the target populations. So each year we get approximately 3.3 million federal dollars. It's a 2-year process. So this year it's about 6.6 million, give or take. And it's matching grants. So 20% match for capital or mobility management projects, capital being things like vehicles and equipment, mobility management, helping people look at what options are available, both at the higher level of the system, so maybe at a county, and actually one-on-one mobility counseling as well. And then 50% is for operating. So that may be things to keep vehicles running, the vehicles that were funded under the capital portion, or it could be for taxi voucher programs, that sort of thing. Next slide. So from July 1st through September 1st, my colleague Sergio and I held 5 virtual pre-application conferences. We also did a couple of one-on-one conferences for people who couldn't make those dates. Those are a requirement of the program. And we go through the application in full detail and the expectations and address questions that anybody may have. So there is a lot of technical assistance involved for the program. And we also promote the opportunity heavily. So we promote it in our TPB news and also on social media. Next slide. So this is just an overview of the numbers. So over 3,000 people received notice about the opportunity. We received 23 applications requesting 11.1 million in federal dollars. We have 6.6 million federal to allocate. So as you can see, the selection committee has a difficult task, which they did quite well, I will say, in determining how to fund what makes sense for the region. So it's about a little over 1.5 times requests versus what's available. Requests were for 109 wheelchair accessible minivans and buses as well. Next slide. This is an overview of the selection criteria. So the selection committee was chaired by Mr. Aguirre, so Chair Aguirre, and we thank him for that. And it was made up of local and national experts. And they recommend projects based on the selection criteria and a discussion that ensues during the selection process. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but I'll just highlight the areas. Coordination is an important part, responsiveness to that coordinated plan. So those priority projects and strategies, how does the application address that? Capacity to manage a federal grant, the feasibility of the project, the regional need. There's a little bump up in points if the project serves an equity emphasis areas. And then we also want to see customer involvement. So that can be things like planning and focus group surveys that involve the intended population. So involving people with disabilities and older adults in either the planning process for the project or the evaluation process for the project. Next slide. So where we're at right now, it's October, and we're in the process of finalizing our selection committee recommendations and getting concurrence from the committee members over what was discussed and recommended. We will then be reaching out to the officers for concurrence of the recommendations prior to the TPB meeting. So the officers who are on today, be on the lookout. We'll be sending out the concurrence memo and request soon. And then in November, I'll be going before tech just to provide an overview of the types of applications received. And then coming back in November before you all to request amendment of the TIP and approval of the resolution for the recommended projects to adopt that resolution. And then the next step after that would be that we would notify applicants of the status and then begin the process of submitting the projects to FTA for approval. And then finally, because as I said, this was a biennial process, our next solicitation will be summer of 2023. And I believe that's all. So next slide has my contact information, and I'm happy to answer questions now or later if anybody has any. Feel free to reach out.
Great, thank you, Lynn. Let's just do this. We'll briefly see if there's any top level questions. And obviously you've got Lynn's contact information if anybody has any detailed follow-up questions. But let's start and I'll turn to the district first. Any questions for Lynn? Let me turn to Maryland. Virginia. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Mr. Aguirre, I think I see your hand.
Yeah. Chair Allen, thank you. I just want to make two quick comments. First of all, I want to thank staff again, Lynn and Sergio and everybody else. This is a very huge undertaking. And a quick shout out to the selection committee. We spent about 4 hours on a Wednesday morning, I believe. It's a little hard, you know, having a 4-hour meeting virtually. So I just want to thank the selection committee for all their hard work and input on this as well.
Did you at least get some like coffee and donuts or bagels delivered? Thank you to the selection committee for sure. Anybody else from Virginia? And then WMATA, any other agencies? All right, Lynn, thank you very much. All right, so again, as she said, keep an eye out in your inbox, and at the next monthly meeting is when we will take an action on this. All right, next let me turn to agenda item number 9 on our agenda, which is the draft transit safety targets. And then next month, we're going to be asked to set safety targets for transit systems on a couple of specific measures. We do this as a part of a federal requirement for MPOs like us. Eric Randall, I'm going to turn to you, and you're going to brief us on the proposed transit safety targets.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
All right,
I think we can hear you. Yep.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. My first agenda item this afternoon is the setting of transit safety targets for the region. As the chair stated, this is an annual federal requirement for providers of public transportation and MPOs. And today is a briefing on the draft targets. The board will be asked to approve the final targets at the meeting in November. Next slide, please. So today I'll recap the requirements, the 4 measures for which targets must be set, who has to set these targets, how we calculate the targets, the draft 2021 targets, and show you the targets you adopted last year for reference and comparison. Next slide, please. So performance-based planning and programming is a federal requirement coming out of the MAT 21 and FAST Acts. We set transit safety targets, we set highway safety targets, which you'll see in December. And actually towards the next part of 2022, you'll be seeing quite a few other performance-based planning and programming targets coming to you. But again, this is an annual requirement for transit safety. Transit providers who receive federal funds are required to adopt formal agency safety plans under the rulemaking and to set targets. MPOs then have to set targets for their metropolitan planning areas. Next slide, please. So these are the 4 safety performance measures: fatalities, serious injuries, safety events, and reliability. For the first 3 measures, there are actually 2 targets each. There's a total number and there's a rate target where it's a number based with a denominator of vehicle revenue miles. So for instance, 0.1. And again, more explanation of these is available in a report. That's one of the mail out documents associated with this board item today. Next slide, please. So as I noted earlier, the transit safety rulemaking and requirements apply to transit agencies receive federal funds. So for our region, that means Metro, PRTC, District DOT, Maryland Transit Administration, and local systems in Maryland that are subrecipient of federal funds through the MTA. However, it does not apply to the local Virginia systems who generally do not take any federal transit funds. Next slide, please. So the draft regional targets are based on those set by transit providers in the region. I would like to give my thanks to all the safety staff at your local transit agencies for coordinating on this information with us. TPB staff have not made any adjustments to those adopted by each of the regional providers. The part we have to do is make a regional calculation by adding up all the numbers, which for rate targets means we have to add up the nominators and the denominators to calculate regional rate targets. Next slide, please. So here are the draft targets that we're proposing for 2021. Down the left-hand side are the targets for each mode of public transportation in the region. Heavy rail, which is how Metro Rail would be classified in this region, streetcar for the DC streetcar, and then most bus systems fit under what I've called urban bus there. We also have commuter bus operations in the region, demand response, and van pools. And again, we have to set targets for each of these modes of operation. So across the top are the performance measures, the 4 performance measures, again, the first 3 with both a number and a rate value. I think the key takeaway here is that no agency is setting any fatality target besides 0, and that was the same case last year. However, several hundred serious injuries are anticipated, as are other safety events in the region. Fortunately, I think the news of the past week has borne that out. During discussion of this item at the agenda approval meeting, Mr. Allen noted how challenging it is to set targets for any event that deals with a subject like safety. Our aspirational goal is always 0. So why do we set targets that are, numbers? Firstly, it's a federal requirement that this be an evidence-based expected outcome target setting process as much as possible, and that's across all of the PBPPs. But beyond, or really including that federal guidance, targets are set to provide all of us in the transportation field with information on what is going right and what is not. So these targets are in many ways predictions. If we are near, or even better yet, improving upon our predicted targets, we're probably on the right path. If we are far off or going in the wrong direction, we know we need to do something else. And in many ways, that's the whole point of the federal PPP process. Next slide, please. For comparison, here's the table of targets adopted for 2020. However, as I think everybody knows, last year was hardly normal in any respect, and actual performance ended up being quite different than the targets that were adopted. Next slide, please. So here's some observations. We do have access to actual safety data, which is reported to the FTA's National Transit Database, and anybody can go in and find it online. It's all there posted. And this applies to all public transportation providers in the region. So it also includes data from the Northern Virginia local bus systems. So we can see what was the actual safety performance in 2020. So outcomes in 2020 were affected by reduced operations during the pandemic. There were 5 fatalities in the region associated with transit, 3 on heavy rail and 2 on urban bus systems. There were only 11 serious injuries in heavy rail and none reported on urban bus, which is really impressive considering how many were expected. Safety events were up slightly on heavy rail, down on urban bus. And if you're interested in more detail, you can go to the draft report and see all this in a table at the end of the report. For the 21 targets, we're doing something new. We added a new mode, van pools. Again, every agency has set a target of 0 fatality for all modes, so no change. And in general, agencies are setting improved or lower targets for serious injuries, for safety events, and for liability. So again, when we're setting 21 targets, many of those are based on anticipated reductions in ridership and in service being operated throughout. Next slide, please. So the next steps, we'll take any comments on these draft targets through the end of the month, through October, and then we'll be bringing them back to you for adoption on November 17th. Mr. Chair, that concludes my brief. I'd be happy to take any questions on this item.
Thank you very much, Mr. Randall. And I appreciate you brought it up in your presentation. It's one of these that we have to say right up front, because I know we've had these conversations over the past couple of years. I think every single person on this call, in this meeting, what we want to see from any fatality, from any injury, is that our goal is 0. Like and I know, because we've had these debates over the last couple of years, like it's really hard to have something put in front of us that even shows a number, because every single person here's goal is 0. This does kind of create that cognitive dissonance where we have to put something forward as the MPO for this federal requirement. And Eric, I know it's always a tough job to try to help set goals that acknowledge injury and acknowledge harm. But we all, I just hope it doesn't have to be said, but it will. We all have an expectation of 0, and that's what we're all working toward in our respective spaces. So I think that's just an important thing to make sure it's clear on the record, both for the public, for all of our stakeholders, and I think for each of us as we work with each other on this accountability. But with that, let me turn to questions that we may have from other jurisdictions. And again, Eric, the action will not be until next month, correct? Okay. All right. Excellent. So let me start then, I guess, the opposite way from last time. So now let me turn to WMATA and other agencies first, and I'll go the other way. Okay. Virginia. Mr. Snyder.
Sure, thanks. I wondered if in connection with this next month, we could have a report from Metro on their safety in general, their enterprise risk management, and particularly this last event to the extent that it's possible to get such a briefing. And I do hope that in our action next month, the resolution can reflect, Mr. Chair, the comments you made about our desire for zero all across the board. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Snyder. In terms of the comment piece, Mr. Randall, we can certainly work with you between now and then to think through how we make sure that's very clear. Mr. Snyder, I know you brought this up before as well, so I appreciate that comment there. In terms of a request for just a larger safety briefing, I don't know, Conti, if we can take a look at that, and Sham, I don't know if that would be something where we turn to you as well, but to help think through what that could look like for next month.
Yes, Mr. Allen, we'll follow up with WMATA. I do know that because this is an active, ongoing investigation that now involves the NTSB along with the Washington Metro Rail Safety Commission, getting any sort of report from that collectively is officially released by next month. I'm not sure how timely that would be, but we do plan to bring more detailed briefing to the board on the safety efforts from on road and on transit. So we'll be able to do something. But I will also defer to Sham if any advice he would have for us.
Sure. I think that's a good point too. We may not know quite today what it is we would be wanting or asking for, but perhaps over the coming days or weeks, we'll be able to kind of fine tune that a little bit to then for the next month. Sean, anything you wanted to add to that?
No, Conti said it right. So just as a matter of protocol, because this is now the purview of the NTSB, anything that we would at this point in time comment on if the course goes through and is approved by the NTSB and we're fully compliant with their processes and protocols. So there's no report or information to give out at this point in time. Mr. Snyder, I do think that we have a shared responsibility for making information about the general condition and processes, and as you mentioned, risk management, something that we can at some point in time in the future either present or discuss. So why don't we let the following time be the following time, and Conti, we can follow up with the chairman about the timing of said report back to the TPB. We'd be pleased to.
Thank you, Sean. That makes sense. All right. Any turning back to the issue of the presentation from Eric, let me see if there's any other additional questions there. So we just went through Virginia. Any other Virginia before we move to Maryland? All right, Maryland and the District of Columbia. All right. Thanks.
Charles?
Oh, sorry.
I'm not District of Columbia, but I just want to interrupt and ask Eric to speak louder because I can hear you, but you're just not as loud as everybody else. Thank you.
Lynn, you can be an honorary District of Columbia if you'd like to be. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I was able to kind of hear it, but Eric, I don't know if you maybe pull the mic just a little bit closer. I appreciate it. All right, Eric, thanks again. And again, as a reminder, the action will be next week on that item. That's going to take us to item number 10 on our agenda, the bus transit service and fare equity. You may recall when I started my tenure as chairman in January, I'd mentioned that the importance of bus service and growing our bus ridership throughout the region are the factors that affect bus ridership. Reliability, obviously, but also fare and service levels are very important. Pandemic has highlighted the inequitable impact these two have had on the transit dependent and traditionally underserved populations. Eric Randall's going to brief us on the work staff has been doing on these two topics, both on bus fares and on bus service levels, making sure that we're keeping an eye with an equity lens looking at that. So Eric, let me turn to you and we'll boost your volume levels as well.
Roger, sir, I'll do my best as use my naval officer voice once again. So good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Now my second agenda item for this afternoon, a review of recent work accomplished on evaluating bus transit service and fares in the region with respect to equity. So next slide, please. So today I'll provide an outline of a bus service equity paper that assessed bus transit service for equity during the pandemic that we commissioned, discuss its key findings, quickly demonstrate the web map that has been developed to put all this data together in an accessible way. And then as the second part of my briefing provide some highlights on a bus fare relief equity memo largely prepared by my colleague, Tony Castaneda. We'll speak more about that in the second part. As background, in March 2020, the country shut down for the coronavirus pandemic, the story of the year. However, the second biggest story of the year was a renewed focus on racial equity to various events, as well as the pandemic putting a highlight back on the travel needs of essential workers, many of them in low-income wage professions, and often from traditionally disadvantaged groups in having their travel mobility needs met. Accordingly, in March of this year, TPB staff contracted an analysis of bus service with respect to equity, as we all look forward to recovery from the pandemic. In addition, staff prepared a brief memo on aspects of transit fares, which are closely related to equity. Next slide, please. So the bus service equity white paper is an analysis of service in the region that looked to accomplish two purposes: what to prioritize for recovery and where to look in the future to improve the equity of bus service long term. The scope of work was to evaluate the locations, residences of select population groups in respect to local bus service. And this white paper and web map was prepared for us by consultants, ICF Consulting, and Foursquare Integrated Transportation Planning. Next slide, please. So the white paper analysis was developed to answer two key questions. First, well, let me step back. Examine two key factors. First of all, it looked at where is transit, local bus transit stop locations, frequency of service, peak versus off-peak service, and the span of service, which is when does transit start in the morning, when does it end at night. And then we compare that to the locations of historically disadvantaged populations, looked at COGS equity emphasis areas, and we also looked at essential workers and jobs. And all this used census information, as well as transit information from all the providers in the region. The white paper goes into considerably more detail on where all this data comes from. The whole point of this analysis was to speak to the following questions. Do these select population groups have good access to bus transit compared to the general population? And what is their service like during peak periods to high frequency service, at least every 15 minutes? Because there's a strong feeling that for transit really to be a quality mobility solution for people, for quality of life purposes, for equity purposes, they really need access to service at least every 15 minutes. You know, not just a bus that comes once an hour, but having that access to high frequency service. To step back for a moment, the scope of work focused on local bus service, which provides the broadest coverage and is the most flexible transit mode. Obviously, Metro Rail moves as many people or more people than local bus, but we don't tend to open new stations or shut stations that often. So again, the focus was on bus. This analysis admittedly was of bus service as of March 15th. So some of the information is now out of date as more bus routes and service has been restored throughout the region. However, we still feel that the general conclusions of the analysis still provide direction for further exploration by planners and people in the area. Next slide, please. So the white paper report, there we go. The white paper report has a number of maps, and this is just one example that shows the distribution of persons of color compared to bus stop location in the region. More intense colors represent higher population density. So blue areas are those where people live within a quarter mile of a bus stop. You can see the district and stretching up the I-270 corridor into Merritt, Montgomery County, a lot of blue areas, good access to bus transit. If you look at the red areas, generally more towards the periphery where there isn't as much transit service to begin with, those are the areas where in this case, persons of color living and generally don't have a bus stop within a quarter mile of them. Of course, having that bus stop is just the first aspect throughout the report, and then through the web map that will show you there are a sequence of factors that can be examined. Any area that's read in multiple factors, if you select for persons of color, you select for low income, you select for 0 cars, anything that's read under multiple factors would be an area that's really high priority for transit service improvements. Next slide, please. So what are some of the findings of the report? First question, how does bus transit access for traditionally underserved groups compare to the region's overall population? And in general, persons of color, people with low incomes, 0 one-car households do have higher access to bus stops than the general population. You can read the numbers there, 65% of people of color, 74% of low-income households, etc., compared to 60% of the general population for the region as a whole are within a quarter mile of the bus stop. Next slide, please. For access to that peak high-frequency service at least every 15 minutes, traditionally underserved groups also generally have more access than compared to the region as a whole. Almost half of 0 one-car households, 44% of low-income households, 33% of people of color, compared to 30% of the general population have access to 15-minute or better service in the AM peak period. These numbers will have gone up with the restoration of transit service by the providers in the region. However, it still gives you a ballpark estimate of what access people do have to transit. And the fact is that at a higher level, the low percentage of access to frequent service, even in the peak period, remains a concern, particularly for quality of life and job access. Next slide, please. How does bus transit access to jobs for low-wage work compare to the region overall's population access to jobs? And almost 3/4 of jobs are within a quarter of a mile of a bus stop. This makes sense because a lot of transit service has traditionally been oriented towards serving job centers, activity centers, if you will. So almost the same numbers for low-wage jobs for essential jobs. When you look at that peak period frequency, and in this case, the AM peak frequency, however, less than half of the region's low-wage jobs were accessible via high-quality service. When you look on weekends, on Saturdays, in this case, less than half the region's low-wage jobs were accessible via high-frequency service. Next slide, please. Looking at the COG equity emphasis areas and how do they compare, generally the residents and the job locations in equity emphasis areas have relatively good access to service, up in the 80% to close to 90% for many of the factors. But more analysis is really required to understand if this service is adequate and if it is connecting these populations with their destinations in an efficient manner. Good service to location A where you live and to location B where you work doesn't necessarily mean there's good transit service between A and B. We're just looking at bus stops. We can't compare this to everybody's trip purpose and where they want to go. So again, these are pointers for people to look at when they look at this tool. So next slide, please. Here's the link to the web map that enables viewers to focus in on areas of interest and select the factors of interest. And the white paper is also available through a link on the pop-up banner right here in the middle of the screen. Now, Leo, if we can bring up the web map itself. So here's the website itself. Right there in the middle, there's a little link that says click here, so you can download the white paper. If you scroll down, it gives you a little orientation on how the data is distributed in the 5 memos. You can look at the distribution of transit service. Where is transit right now? You can look at job accessibility. You can look at, the current transit service, what happens at the route level. You can look at the impacts of the pandemic because they did a difference graph between what used to be before the pandemic and what was during the pandemic. Maybe not so useful now, but it's still indicative of what decisions were made. And then finally, we had them put together sort of an index analysis. There are a lot of different numbers out there. How do we combine them? So they came up with an index analysis where they put all the numbers together. And this is sort of like an overall grade report, if you will, that identifies those areas that probably best need most transit access. So if we click OK, Leo, and just show everyone a sample of the map. So looking over to the left, you can see the geographic boundaries for the TPB jurisdictions. And then the COG equity emphasis areas are highlighted in pink. If we can move down the screen a little bit. Yeah. So today we're going to look at the US 1 corridor along Richmond Highway down in Fairfax County, which is of course where there are plans to put in a major bus rapid transit route over the next decade. And you can see the other COG equity emphasis areas there outlined in pink. If we go to the upper right, here are the layers for the memo. So we can look at the distribution of transit service. We can click on that button and click on persons of color. And here the map shows up again. Again, blue is where people are close to bus stops. Red is where people are not close to bus stops. And the more intense the color, the more people are further away. So if you look at this, you can kind of get an idea of, hey, there are a lot of blue areas. There's pretty decent transit around this region, but there are definitely red areas where people of color are living who don't have access to a bus stop. Can do many other layers in this. Do they have access to bus early in the morning? Do they have it late at night, AM peak, midday, Saturday, Sunday, so forth? Next button that we talked about. Right, so if we fourth one down, weekday AM peak. Right, this maps all the bus routes. So again, the intensity shows you the high frequency service, and you can see that there's high frequency service traveling up and down Route 1. But as you get away from Route 1, service comes less frequent with sometimes over 60-minute headways. And so the idea is this looks at that frequency of bus service. So again, this is a tool. You can focus in on an area of interest. Transit planners, equity planners can look at an area of interest and toggle through these layers. One more over to the right. Yep. So again, we came up with that transit equity need index, which tries to put all the numbers together in a big letter. Where that index is higher is where we're saying that based on frequency, transit frequency, based on transit coverage, based on where people of color, low income, other traditionally disadvantaged groups live. That index score, where it's high, where it's dark green, that's the areas where we probably need to look at providing more transit service. So if you zoom back out of the map, you can obviously see this for the region as a whole. I just focused on one area because it's a little stand. And so I encourage everyone to go to the link, which I see has been put into the chat box if they're interested in exploring their particular region or area for this. That concludes the demonstration of the web map. Thanks, Leo. If we can go back to the presentation. So moving on to fair equity, the second part of the presentation, all credit for this belongs to my colleague, Tony Castaneda. He's the author of this memo with the assistance of all of us at TPB staff, on which the presentation is based. Again, this memo is provided in the meeting mail-out materials, and we completed this work in-house because this is happening all across the region. Many other organizations, agencies are looking at equity. We just try to bring it together for some of our purposes. So next slide, please. So the purpose of our memo was to synthesize recent transit fare relief efforts locally and nationally. And fare relief is a term we came up with to encompass policies that are both fare-free or means-tested discounts and subsidies. So other similar terms include zero fares, reduced fares, need-based fares. Fare relief was an umbrella term. So the focus for this memo was to provide an overview of the two broad categories, free fares and other fare relief efforts. Look at the lessons learned from agencies who have implemented such policies and how they are affected by and can impact ridership, service, safety, and equity. Next slide, please. So for some perspective, pre-pandemic in 2019, the National Capital Region provided over 170 million transit trips in the calendar year across the 12 local bus services. And those bus services collected $168 million in fare revenues. Of course, then the pandemic came, pretty much all service providers suspended fare collection, at least in local bus service, in the interest of public health and safety, and ridership fell 20 to 80% across the region. And you can see the table there lists all the fares that were collected by providers in the region. Average fare paid by a passenger was just under $1 at 99 cents in 2019. Fare recovery ratio, which is the portion of operating costs covered by fares, ranged from 4% up to 27%. Next slide, please. That's where that's. So most local bus agencies in the region have resumed fare collection this year. Again, though, over the last year, we saw a renewed focus on equity and the importance of encouraging transit ridership to meet local and regional goals, reduce congestion, and improve the quality of life. So some agencies have remained free fare, both for the pandemic and for other reasons. Montgomery County Ride-On still free. City of Fairfax Q is still free. Omni Ride Local was still free. Dash has introduced free fares. Over the past couple of years, they've been working on a complete restructuring of bus network throughout the city of Alexandria. And as part of that decision, they also examined fare options, in part supported by a TLC grant from the TPB. And decision was made in the city to go fare free. So since September 5th, I can walk outside my house and catch a bus and don't have to pay any fare, which is great. However, this is a decision for every system and every jurisdiction to look at, and there are some important factors to consider as we go through this. Next slide, please. So fare relief initiatives have existed in the region for at least the last 20 years. Notable examples include WMATA's Anacostia buy down, where bus routes that serve the Anacostia area have had bus fares reduced. There are also other fare relief programs like the Kids Ride Free program in the district in Montgomery County, similar programs for students in Fairfax County and City of Fairfax. DC Circulator piloted free fare service in 2019, then restored fares, then got rid of them for the pandemic, and they're still evaluating options there in coordination with the DC Council. I already noted that many other organizations are working on fare relief considerations. NVTC completed a very detailed, lengthy white paper on zero fare and reduced fare options for Northern Virginia transit providers, which has been discussed at the Northern Virginia Transportation Commission. The state of Virginia has introduced their TRIP, Transit Ridership Incentive Program, which is a grant program to improve transit regionally and reduce barriers to transit use by supporting low income and zero fare programming. Mr. Allen can, of course, speak to his Metro for DC proposal, which would provide a benefit to residents throughout DC. So again, this is just one arrow, if you will, in the quiver of arrows that are all looking at fare relief programs in the region. Looking beyond the region, there's been a considerable number of studies, pilots, and papers exist on the topic, with efforts dating back to the 1960s, sort of in the era of Great Society, when various systems tried out fare-free programs. But just within the past decade, a number of sizable transit systems have implemented their own programs, notably Seattle, Portland, and Kansas City. Larger agencies have implemented means-tested programs, including New York City, the San Francisco Bay Area, where 21 transit agencies came together to form a regional agreement. And Los Angeles is considering implementing zero fares for low-income people, which would have a cost of several hundred million dollars per year. It'll be interesting to see how the politics in Los Angeles play out over the next year. Next slide, please. In reviewing all the experience that has been gained locally and nationally over the past decades in fare relief programs, here are some of the key takeaways that we wanted to highlight to you. When you reduce fares or get rid of fares entirely, ridership gains have been experienced, which is sort of a goal of most transit systems. But there are large impacts, particularly in heavily utilized systems, with ridership gains from 20% up to 75%. I believe that was Kansas City for systems that went fare free. And the question is, how do you handle all these people? Fare relief can improve the safety and equity of bus riders and safety of bus operators by limiting fare disputes, and fare enforcement, which disproportionately impact minority and low-income transit riders. Fare relief can improve the quality of life and sustainability of local communities and meet other goals, such as reducing emissions and reducing traffic congestion. However, as pointed out, with ridership gains, particularly in larger systems, the results can be overwhelming. While smaller agencies with lower ridership can often absorb ridership growth without the need for additional buses or operators, larger systems, middle-sized, large, may need to consider additional vehicle procurement, staffing needs, increased costs to provide transportation to everybody wanting it. And that can be a significant issue. Of course, the largest obstacle to implementing fare relief programs is the cost. Loss of fare revenues is an important barrier to implementation. Again, for the region, $172 million in 2019. That transportation funding is removed as a source of revenue. Where else does the revenue come from? Decision for councils, agencies across the region for anybody who pursues such a program. Again, those are just some of the key lessons learned. I encourage anybody interested to look at the fare relief memo, or those of you involved in VTC, other discussions. There's a lot of other information out there. Montgomery County also just completed a report October 1st looking at options for Montgomery County with valuable information as well. So next slide, please. Again, thanks to my colleague, Antonio Castaneda, who's also on this meeting, and happy to respond to any questions. Mr. Chair, that concludes my briefing.
Thanks so much, Eric and Antonio, for some really great work. I can't wait to kind of just nerd out and play around with that website and the tool that you created. So, so we appreciate that. Yeah, you know, I think this is a really important conversation for us to think about from the standpoint both around how do we focus on equity, how do we make sure that, especially as we've gone through a year and a half of pandemic, how we make policy decisions that aim at those that have been hardest hit and keep the equity lens front and center. And I also think this is a really important part of our conversation about how we help our transit systems recover and grow ridership back, which is crucial, I think, not just to the success of our transit agency, but it's successful for all of our businesses, for our employers, for our entire region. Like this is, to me, this is one of those great unifiers that certainly is not a DC or a Maryland or a Virginia issue. It is all of us, because if one goes down, all of us go down. It's very much of a regional type of conversation, which is exactly what this is so great for. So first, I just thank you again, Eric and Antonio, for some really impressive and hard work that goes into this. I think I'll just say myself, when I think about it, it's not just about the fares. I know when I look at our bus routes, for example, just focusing on the district, it is equally important about, can you afford the ride, to does the ride even get you where you need to go? Can you rely on it? Is it going to get you to school? Is it going to get you to work? Is it going to get you to the grocery store, to the doctor's office? All of those pieces go in it. So you kind of can't do one without the other. And that's kind of the way I try to think about it. Is I know a lot of conversation sometimes goes on, can we just, do fare free? That's just one side of the coin. And, I'm not going to spend my time pitching our bill in DC, but really trying to think about it from the perspective of both addressing the fare issues as well as that service reliability expansion. I guess in that vein a little bit, I'll just kick off one question, then we'll do kind of our jurisdictional round. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Sean, but just thinking about it from a WMATA perspective with, obviously being one of our largest operators here. It feels like in the last year, like WMATA has definitely made some really good decisions, I think, with equity in mind, right? Like thinking about the fares, around some of the service decisions. Anything that you can share with us, though, perhaps about, are there things that, is there a reexamination of bus service for equity in mind being planned at WMATA? I know when we think about our bus lines, it feels oftentimes that, I'll use one line as an example, the 74 line, which runs through Southwest, and there was a proposal to scale it back. And the problem was, though, it runs right through low-income communities, public housing, very bus and transit dependent. But the ridership, if I'm just looking at it from that perspective, perhaps the ridership didn't necessarily justify as much as another route. But for that community, it was a really big equity issue. And we worked together, and I think we preserved most of what we were looking for there. But from a systems perspective, Sean, anything you want to share about what's happening at WMATA as you think about that equity lens and evaluation for bus service?
Yeah, absolutely. And Mr. Chairman, if I may have, it's 40 pounds in a 10-pound bag. If I may have 15 pounds of that bag, because there's a lot here. this topic of transit equity, Mr. Chairman and board, it's expansive. It touches demography, education, economy, environment, and understanding who rides transit and how they experience the system is critical to doing this right, and also understanding these inequities. To level set, just at one model alone, 80% of our bus riders are persons of color. Almost 50% live in households that make under $30,000 annually, and almost 60% do not have access to a personal vehicle. And on Metro bus, those demographics are very different from Metro Rail, which is majority white. Almost 50% of our Metro Rail customers make over $100,000 annually. 75% have access to a car. And we're all watching as Metro bus continues to outpace Metro Rail since the first week of the pandemic and coming. But really, we're dealing with a tale of two systems, and that's a hard thing to contend with as a region. So we applaud COG and TPB's focus on addressing existing inequities and doing their part to create a more equitable region. The COG board's actions last week to be more intentional about prioritizing transit and elevating equity and future growth, while also creating a brand new grant program. Those are steps in the right direction, and we also applaud the region and TPB specifically. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Conti. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your renewed focus on improving bus service and asking this question about reducing fares. With the following note that we've asked our customers, not just last year, not just year before that, but for the last 20 years, frequency, reliability, that's what they want. Pricing is not the second or third or fourth most important thing. It's the 15th most important thing. So if you make it free, but the bus is only running half an hour, you haven't done anything. So let's not get distracted by this shiny object of free when it's not frequent. Doesn't work. On WMATA's side, we're thrilled that the adoption of the bus transformation project was something that had put it front and center, but also in the face of the pandemic, we launched a frequent service network this fall, like sailing into the wind. So we took 20 bus lines and put them on par with rail. It literally doubled the number of bus customers. We talked about the demography of bus customers earlier, who are now receiving 12-minute or better service. That's a big deal. But we're only one bus provider. The City of Alexandria, their shift to free fares on Dash, on their new transit network, they redrew their map, greatly increased access to frequent all-day service for low-income persons of color and seniors in the city. Mr. Chairman, your proposal in the district to create a transit subsidy for residents, along with the mayor's commitment to advance 51 bus priority projects over 60 miles over the next 8 years. Those are big deals for transit equity. And Prince George's County has recently completed a BRT plan, and we're coordinating with the county and state highway to accelerate bus priority. So there's a lot going on, and this still doesn't feel like quite enough, does it? So it's going to require more work, more difficult conversations, and more difficult decisions about how you spend those resources. The thing I just want the board to come away with is that the spotlight often falls on us. By us, I mean Metro. And, candidly, I've spent my life in public service working in communities of need from the get-go. So I am passionate about this. I think about my former students as a former teacher in East LA and Harlem, and how transit for them was life. That's why I do this. But here in the DC region, most jurisdictions operate and enforce the roads that pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit vehicles use every day. So are we as a region also committing to make space on those roadways for buses to move and not be held prisoner by single occupancy vehicles? Are we doing that or not? How do we prioritize buses? And almost every jurisdiction operates a bus system. So it'd be nice to see how each of these systems is prioritizing equity within their own system. And finally, this confederation of 13 or more bus systems that we operate and pat ourselves in the back and say it all kind of works because we do a lot of collaboration. Our customers are telling us it doesn't. So at some point in time, we have to confront the fact that what we as policymakers and operators think is working to our customers is confusing. That disconnect is still one that seems to be an interminable discussion here in the region. So what's next? We're currently developing a transit equity strategy that unites and expands our existing actions like the frequent service network. Can we double down on that? Establish some equity goals and metrics for us so we can proactively think about equity as we make our next service plans and budgets. That's a good step in the right direction. And it's clear that all of us have a role to play. Mr. Chairman, you mentioned where the bus goes. I want to give just a quick nod to that question because I think you led with that, so I'm going to close with that. As was recommended in the bus transformation strategy, which our board adopted almost 2 years ago, early 2019, 3 years ago. We are now scoping a bus network redesign of the WMATA network and its service. We've been meeting with our regional partners. We met with our joint coordinating committee in February. We conducted multiple work sessions with jurisdictional staff and local operators. We secured their intent to participate via written commitments. So we have those agreements upon the local operators' desired level of participation. We've created a scope that reflects those arrangements. Equity will be a major driver in how we conceptualize and prosecute that work. And that so that also this future network can properly address the region's goals of addressing climate change and creating a more affordable region. So we have the funding approved. We have the jurisdictional levels of participation confirmed. We have the project scope, and now it's ready to launch. I'm just waiting executive approval to do so.
All right, excellent. I realize I asked you the 40-pound question, but I appreciate all the information there. I will ask you the 4-ounce question, and that is you're waiting for approval, meaning you're waiting for the WMATA board to take an action. Just what does that mean?
Within WMATA, I'm waiting for the executive team to approve us to launch the project.
All right. I guess maybe we can think about ways that we can help push or support that decision. All right, just for the sake of time, though, I'm going to be quiet and let me turn to colleagues here. I was going to go this time to Maryland first and then Virginia, but I can't see how many hands are up right now. I do see Mr. Glass. I see your hand up, so let me turn to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I really appreciate this conversation at this point in time. Very timely for all the reasons you and Shyam and others have stated, and the deep dive, the brief deep dive that you provided is a good entry point for those who have not yet engaged your local government and community in this conversation. 2-3 years ago in Montgomery County, when I led the effort to make Kids Ride free all the time, to expand that program, exactly as was stated, ridership among youth increased 50%, a little more than 50%, both on Ride-On and on Metrobus. So if you lower those barriers to entry, they're going to use it. And the same demographic data of who the riders are. And 50% of our riders make less than $30,000 a year. And so again, very timely conversation, especially as we also are going to be, I think it's a fait accompli at this point in time. We'll be reducing our fares from $2 to $1. I personally will continue the march to lower that even further. But for the point of this conversation and given the time, Shyam, I appreciate your presentation. And the one question I have at this point, and I'll probably follow up with you in private after, but the interplay between WMATA and all the local jurisdictions. Are the regional jurisdictions, is there support for the work that you are doing? How do we enhance and educate not only our residents, but other leaders who might not see the merit in this? And then quite frankly, because we also work with our states, especially in Montgomery County and Maryland, who manage and control most of our roads, our major thoroughfares, there might be hesitancy there too. So what can we all do to make sure that we continue pushing this agenda forward?
I appreciate that, Councilmember Glass. And as a resident, by the way, I have to tell you a personal story. My son comes back with his ID card from school and says, "I can ride the bus now." So, well, you always could ride the bus, but now it's just easier. So it's a big deal. Thank you for that. So the 3 things that are tactical that you have the power to advance right now. I know that when we constructed the bus service guidelines that WMATA adopted last year, they were intended to promote a better, more reliable, more data-driven bus network. And the intent was that those could apply to all the buses in the region so the customer isn't forced to try and figure out what type of service they're going to get on what route. That might be something that you can consider doing so that we can synchronize the service profiles of the different bus networks. I know that the different bus providers in the region are already trying to synchronize the way in which pricing is executed. And then we appreciate the fact that there's a lining up, if you will, of what fare techniques are being employed at Metro and then making sure that's synchronized with the regional providers. And yet to date, we know that our multimodal passes, which we introduced last year, that allow anyone who purchases one of our multimodal passes to ride both bus and rail, they are not accepted universally among the different bus providers in the region. So again, unlocking those barriers for the customers, they don't have to figure out, they don't really care about the color of the bus. They don't care about the boundary. They want to go places. So those are things within our control. And then the extent to which I know I want to give up a great deal of thanks to Director Conklin and Mr. Ehrenreich, who have sat down at the table and really asked some probing questions. They've been great partners and collaborators. And when they're thinking about everything from capital locations for fleet and facilities to actual routes, they're very thoughtful. But certainly as a region, we're right now prosecuting 3 or 4 different versions of bus priority. They all kind of feel different. And interestingly, they all end up with a different brand. And again, we're confusing the customer. So what can we do to simplify this for the customer so they don't have to figure out what the name or brand or color or payment methodology is for the bus? They just want to go places. Those are my near-term things we have our power to do right now. Over the medium term, just think about this. At Metro, 11% of our low-income customers receive any type of fare subsidy, including tax-deferred transit. That number for our medium to high-income customers is 57%. And I applaud the district's efforts to pilot a low-income fare product, a variety of different versions. We're working with the district right now to pilot one. Chair Allen has another proposal. But the fact of the matter is that the transit subsidy is not going to those who need it most. So what can we do to follow the example from other regional transit, transit environments that have found a way to bring those resources to those who need it most? That's a medium-term objective. Longer term, how do we go beyond coordination, collaboration to synchrony? That's a bigger political question, which I can't answer right now.
Sure. Well, thank you for that explanation. And I hope your son is enjoying Ride On in Metrobus in Montgomery County.
Thank you very much. Yes, he is. Thank you.
Thanks, Evan. Let me just do this quick programming note for everybody, seeing as we have just a little bit less than 10 minutes left. Item number 11 on our agenda is not time pressing. So Conti and I just connected, and so we're going to bump that since I see several hands up and we have just a few minutes left. So I want to make sure that we have time to get to that. So I believe Ms. Russell, and then Ms. Umstad, and then Mr. Wohan, and then Mr. Dorsey. Let's go in that order. That's the way I saw the hands.
Thank you. Just quickly, since all of this is very much tied to the equity emphasis areas and that map is to be updated with new census data, just wondering if staff could touch on that very briefly on how that's going to occur.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Russell. Yeah, that's important, particularly given today's resolution and COG's resolution last week as well. We have clearly now indicated our policy level preference to use such equity emphasis area type of methodology, or that particular methodology, to inform planning and programming decision making. So we want to make sure that those areas, those geographic areas that we have identified, the intensity of the concentration of this traditionally underserved population does reflect the latest population data we have, which is the 2020 census. So we have worked into our plan to update that plan. Census Bureau has just released part of the information. Additional information is expected early part of next year. So we will be updating equity emphasis areas using the latest data set. Thanks.
Great, thanks. All right, I think I have Ms. Umstead next.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. 2 points. Anyway, these are great presentations. One is that I'm hoping we can have a more nuanced definition of who might need more regular bus service. The the people of color map showed an area in Loudoun County where we have a very large population of first and second generation immigrants who are fairly well-to-do, and we have tried running a bus system through that area, and there has not been much interest at all. The second issue is the map seems to show the local bus routes, but for Loudoun at least does not seem to show our regional bus routes. And so I wonder if we could take a closer look at those. I don't know if the other jurisdictions are seeing the same problem, but in general, I think income levels are probably for Loudoun County, a more accurate way to assess need rather than a community that has a large number of people of color. So I just appreciate any further clarification that we could get going forward. Thank you.
Very good points, Ms. Umstead. We'll definitely work that in. We'll provide in the memo the clarity. I think in our mapping system, there should be an ability to look at those geographic areas, either by race or by income level. I completely agree with you that income level more often is a much more significant deterrent to providing accessible transportation. So.
Great. Thanks. Let's see, Mr. Wohan, I think I had you next in the lineup, then Mr. Dorsey, and then Mr. Snyder. If we still have time, we'll turn to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very, very brief. I'm just wondering if a next step might be that we might also look at not just the distance from bus service, but also how accessible they are by walking and biking and safe walking and bicycling infrastructure, because I believe that's an important investment and something that we need to prioritize in the region is making sure that people are able to safely walk or bike to bus service.
Great, thanks. Did you want Eric to respond to that, or just making that note?
Yeah, either you can respond by email too. That'd be great.
Okay, will do. All right, Mr. Dorsey.
Thank you, Chair Allen. Hopefully, I'm going to offer a complementary perspective to the excellent comments from Sham and yourself in framing this issue. Bus is, from a normative perspective, often seen as the lesser mode for reasons of bias that people have about who uses bus, but also from transit planners and decision makers because it's not fixed rail, it's not fixed route. And so that's often seen as a disincentive to investment in the levels of utility that transit needs in order to leverage economic development, et cetera. I would offer that we ought to rethink our perspective and the ability to adjust bus to make it more useful for all of the ways in which you both talked about is a great virtue when it comes to meeting the needs of the community and an evolving world of commercial and retail investment. And I think some of that is, data and planning driven. Some of it is just really checking our assumptions and our values and the utility of transit to be adjusted to become more efficient and more useful in terms of being more frequent, having better connections with destinations, being reliable and comfortable and affordable, not just in terms of money, but time for the user are great benefits that we haven't fully maximized. And I would encourage jurisdictions as you're thinking about your bus programs. We often think about bus productivity as a reason to either continue routes or to determine levels of service on routes. It should instead invite the question when we see low productive routes, we should ask ourselves why. And is our transit not useful in all of the ways it needs to be? And then furthermore, I just say, as far as the fare conversation, I get it. Revenues matter, and we can easily calculate revenues that would be lost if we think about subsidies or fare-free systems. But I would offer that we should also think about the cost in terms of greenhouse gas emissions that we get from utilizing transit more and equate that to the dollar revenue that we fear that we're losing. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Dorsey. A lot of nodding heads as you were talking, so thank you. All right, just given time, Mr. Snyder, I'm going to turn to you for last comment or question. What I'm going to do is I think I have a suggestion on a quick next step to do after that. So Mr. Snyder, I'll turn to you, then I'll give a quick last comment and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, a couple quick comments. First of all, I'm interested in more study of the role of BRT and how that can assist all of this. Secondly, I note that we refer to bus stops. Well, the reality is a lot of bus stops don't have bus shelters. So I think part of service needs to be, this has been a priority for us, to provide actually shelters for people as opposed to waiting out without any comfort whatsoever for the next bus. The third area would be, I'd be interested in pursuing not only how we better serve low-income folks, but also how we get others onto our transportation systems so that the ultimate cost to government is reduced and we have other riders that are attracted to our systems. Finally, I would note, very careful when looking at WMATA. Virginia funds WMATA in a very different way than Maryland and DC. So it affects our local government. So I think that needs to be taken into account. Again, thanks for the work. I look forward to more. Take care.
Thank you, Mr. Snyder. And again, to Eric and Antonio, thank you for the really hard work there. Sham, thank you for laying out all those issues there. I'll say this feels like this really connected. It seems like for a lot of folks, this is something that continues to be a priority. We know there's a lot of work to do. I don't know, Conti, I think we've talked a little about this, but one idea could be, if staff could look at actually incorporating the comments we had, the work that we just did there. Could there be a letter to WMATA and other transit agencies talking about this work that we've just done, asking for that service reexamination, redesign, making that a higher priority? Would that be something you think might be an appropriate step for staff to help draft a letter so that TPB can keep pushing this?
Absolutely. I'd be clearly the sense of the board I get is not only this is relevant to all of them at the local level and at the regional level, there is a sense of priority. There's a sense of urgency to do something like this. We'll be happy to draft a letter. I'll work with the executive committee to review the draft letter so we can send it to WMATA and then also to the 11 other transit agencies in the region, encouraging them to take that reexamination. Certainly.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. All right, well, that's going to take us right at a couple of minutes after 2 o'clock. So again, just for anybody who might have missed it, item number 11, we're going to make sure we come back to on the next agenda, but that we really couldn't cut short that conversation, so I appreciate it. Let me thank everybody for the discussion and for the actions throughout the day. Our next meeting is scheduled for November 17th, 2021. Conti, are you personally delivering Thanksgiving TPB lunches to everybody's house? Is that how this is going to work?
I don't know if Lynn will appreciate me spilling the beans a little bit. We are looking at what can be done in terms of coordinated delivery. Maybe we'll try to pull it off, but it's been thinking. Thanks.
All right, so get your orders in for if you're dark meat or white meat, do you like the turkey leg? Go ahead and get that order into Conti, and he'll take care of it from there. All right, well, thank you everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks for this really great conversation, and I will see you all again very soon, and if not sooner than on the 17th. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.